strategically placed spikes that were meant to impale the body, but in such a way that it wouldn't kill the human inside, only prolong their agony. It would go into places that were very painful, but not particularly deadly.
Throughout history, cruelty has often been crafted into unimaginable forms, each more barbaric than the last. Some were designed to break the body, others to shatter the spirit, where infamous figures like the ruthless Spanish Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, and the notorious Queen Mary of England were linked to devices that inflicted unimaginable suffering. Want to know the stories that inspired them? Join us as we take a chilling look into history's darkest corners, where twisted minds crafted some of the most brutal torture devices. Here are history's most vicious torture devices. Spanish donkey. Among the many cruel and horrifying devices used throughout history, the Spanish donkey, also known as the wooden horse or the wooden pony, was one of the most painful and terrifying. This simple yet terrifying contraption was designed to break its victim, both physically and mentally, causing excruciating pain that could last for hours or days. The Spanish donkey consisted of a wooden triangular seat with sharp spikes protruding from its top. The victim was made to sit naked on this triangular seat, with the spikes aimed at their most sensitive areas. The device was often used for interrogation, and the victim's legs were either tied or weighted down to force them to sit firmly on the spikes. This would cause immense pain, leading to severe injury, internal bleeding, and even death in some cases. The device worked by placing intense pressure on the victim's body, especially on their private areas. As the person was forced to remain seated on the spiked wooden seat, the pain would be almost unbearable. The sharp points would penetrate the victim's body, causing deep wounds. The more they struggled, the deeper they would be driven into their skin. Additionally, the victim's legs were often tied with weights or their feet placed in restraints, forcing them to sit still and endure the pain for much longer. The longer the victim stayed on the device, the worse the damage. One of the most horrifying aspects of the Spanish donkey was its psychological torture. The victim would be fully aware that the pain was never going to stop unless they confessed or begged for mercy. This created a sense of hopelessness and terror that was often enough to make people crack under pressure, confessing to crimes they might not have committed just to escape the agony. One chilling story comes from the time of the Spanish Inquisition, when a woman named Maria was accused of witchcraft. She was taken to the dungeon and forced onto the Spanish donkey. Days passed, and the torture continued. Maria's body was covered in blood from the wounds inflicted by the spikes. Her confession came not from guilt, but from the need to stop the overwhelming pain. Thankfully, devices like the Spanish donkey eventually faded into history. The cruel methods of torture that were once commonplace began to be seen for what they truly were: inhumane acts of brutality. By the 19th century, with the rise of more progressive views on human rights and justice, such devices were abandoned. The Spanish donkey became a symbol of the dark past of torture and a reminder of the extreme measures once used to extract confessions or punish those who were seen as enemies of the state or church. The Wheel of Agony. In the darkest depths of medieval Europe, a terrible instrument known as the breaking wheel or Catherine wheel reflected the era's cruel concept of justice. This terrible device, notorious for its heinous murders, sowed terror across the continent. From Paris's cobblestone streets to Germany's fortified towns, the wheel served as a terrifying reminder of the terrible punishments meted out to criminals and rebels. The broken wheel was most notorious in the Middle Ages, especially in France and Germany. This wooden behemoth, frequently larger than 6 feet in diameter, was erected horizontally and equipped with spokes designed to break bodies rather than propel motion. Executioners wielding iron bars or hammers stripped victims. They then chained them to a wheel and broke their bones. Skilled torturers took satisfaction in extending the misery, with some executions lasting days. What's the ultimate goal? A public display intended to create fear and deter crime. One noteworthy occurrence occurred in 1581, when serial killer Peter Neers was subjected to 42 bone-shattering strikes before dying. Similarly, in 1757, Robert-François Damiens, who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV, was executed in front of thousands. Witnesses, including the philosopher Voltaire, were shocked. They called the spectacle impossible to express in words. The wheel's popularity was not exclusive to Western Europe. In Russia, rebel commander Yemelyan Pugachev faced the device in 1775 on Catherine the Great's orders. His terrible death inspired Alexander Pushkin's masterpieces. During the Enlightenment, voices such as Cesare Beccaria advocated for reform and condemned such cruelty. His important treatise on crimes and punishments persuaded some governments, like Catherine the Great's and Tuscany's Grand Duke Leopold's, to end torture. By the late 18th century, the breaking wheel had gone out of favor, with France outlawing it in 1789 and Prussia following suit in 1841. Today, bits of this ominous device are in museums. They include Germany's Medieval Crime Museum and Amsterdam's Torture Museum, reminding tourists of a darker time in history. The Bleeding Judas Cradle. Of the grim medieval torture devices, the Judas Cradle stands out. Also called the Judas Chair, it caused both pain and terror. This pyramid-shaped contraption was cruelly ingenious. It was designed to torment its victims, not to kill them quickly. Its purpose was to force confessions or break their spirits. The Judas Cradle worked by suspending the victim above a sharply pointed pyramid using a system of ropes. The person, often stripped of clothing to maximize the ordeal, would be slowly lowered onto the apex of the device. The sharp point would press against or enter their most sensitive areas. The torturer controlled the descent, prolonging the torment as needed. It could take hours or even days. The torturers sought confessions, information, or compliance. One chilling story tied to the Judas Cradle involves a man accused of heresy in 16th century Spain. This man, an educated scholar named Tomás, had been accused by the Inquisition of secretly practicing a banned religion. Tomás vehemently denied the charges, but his captors believed he was lying. He was led to the torture chamber, where the Judas Cradle awaited. Tomás was suspended above the device, and the Inquisitor gave him one last chance to confess. When he refused, the ropes were slowly loosened. The pointed tip of the cradle pressed into him, and the agony was immediate. Tomás screamed, but his cries were met with cold indifference. Over hours, his body was repeatedly raised and lowered. Despite his pleas for mercy, the Inquisitors persisted. His resolve crumbled. He finally confessed. It's unclear if he was truthful or just trying to end his suffering. However, after his release, he died from an infection. It was a grim reminder of the cradle's long-lasting effects. The Judas Cradle was not only about physical pain. Torture chambers aimed to instill fear. Victims often watched others suffer before their turn. Watching the Judas Cradle in use was terrifying. Someone was writhing in agony, blood pooling beneath them. This psychological warfare often broke prisoners before they were even subjected to the device. Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull of ancient Sicily is one of history's most notorious torture devices, combining myth, dictatorship, and horrible ingenuity. This hollow bronze figure was meant to roast its victims alive. It was created in the city of Acragas around 560 BCE, during the reign of the tyrant Phalaris. Phalaris, known for his cruelty, governed one of Sicily's wealthiest Greek colonies. The city's greatness, shown by the Valley of the Temples, contrasted with the tragedies that occurred under his rule. The bull was created by Perilos of Athens, a skilled bronze artisan who wanted to court favor with the dictator. He proposed a life-size hollow bull with a door on the side to house the condemned. A fire beneath the statue would roast the victim alive. Tubes in the bull's head would turn their screams into bellowing roars. Phalaris was intrigued by the invention and requested its rapid implementation. After finishing it, he humorously tested it on its creator, Perilos. The craftsman was forced inside, his screams booming like the bull's roar. Phalaris saved him from death in the bull, but he later had Perilos thrown down a cliff. This guaranteed that his creation could never be reproduced. The device became a representation of Phalaris's reign of terror. The bull killed political opponents, criminals, and even innocent citizens. The bull's evil reputation spread beyond Sicily. It appeared in the works of Greek thinkers and Roman historians like Cicero. He detailed its psychological and physical agonies. Even after Phalaris's defeat, the Brazen Bull remained a grim symbol of tyranny. Roman dictators like Caligula supposedly admired it. Centuries later, it was still used in debates about justice and power abuse. Aega of Nabis. Imagine being forced into a room with a horrific statue, its body covered in sharp spikes, waiting to pierce anyone who dares to touch it. This gruesome invention, known as the Aega of Nabis, was conceived by one of the cruelest rulers of ancient Greece, Nabis, and inspired by his equally ruthless wife, Aega. Nabis took control of Lacedaemon after the death of his predecessor, Machanidas, in 207 BC. His reign was marked by terror as he used fear and violence to cement his control over the region. Unlike many tyrants of the era, Nabis sought out innovative ways to intimidate and punish those who opposed him. His most notorious creation was the Aega of Nabis. It was a terrifying device that caused pain without killing its victim right away. This device was named after his wife, Aega, whose greed and cruelty were as notorious as her husband's. The Aega of Nabis was a statue designed to look like a woman, but with a sinister twist. Her body was studded with sharp spikes. These spikes were strategically placed across her arms and chest, turning the figure into a grotesque trap. The cruel twist came when intoxicated victims were placed in a room with the statue. As they stumbled into it, they would inevitably touch the spikes, which would pierce their flesh. It was a slow, agonizing form of torture that didn't kill outright, but left the victim to suffer. But what makes the Aega of Nabis truly fascinating is not just its terrifying design, but the sophisticated methods of its operation. It wasn't just a crude statue, it was an elaborate contraption. Nabis reportedly used a complex system of switches. It let him operate it personally, ensuring precise pain delivery. This method of torture wasn't just for show, it was a tool of control. The device was a physical manifestation of Nabis's tyranny. Pain, suffering, and fear were his ways of maintaining power. Though the Aega of Nabis may not have lasted through the centuries, it remains a chilling reminder. It shows the extreme measures rulers would take to assert control. Guillotine's dark legacy. On a misty morning in Paris, the guillotine rose tall, with its keen blade reflecting the rising sun. This machine, notorious for its terrible role in history, has become a symbol of revolution and justice. Although strongly linked to the French Revolution, its use spread throughout Europe, leaving a bleak legacy. Victor Hugo regarded it as a formidable legal tool that demanded attention and could not be ignored. The guillotine's history begins with Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, a physician who sought a more humane method of executing convicts. In 1789, amid France's revolutionary wave, he proposed a mechanism that would assure speedy, painless deaths for everybody, regardless of status. "With my machine," he boasted, "you won't even feel it." However, this invention was not wholly new. Similar devices, such as the Halifax gibbet in England and the Maiden in Scotland, had been employed previously. Dr. Antoine Louis improved the design, and Tobias Schmidt, a German carpenter, constructed the first guillotine. It made its debut in 1792, claiming the life of a highwayman named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. The guillotine rose to prominence during the Reign of Terror, which saw hundreds decapitated, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. It operated so smoothly that it could execute up to 3,000 people per month. Witnesses described the executioners as emotionless and mechanical owing to their repetitive tasks. Even revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre died under its blade, bringing the Reign of Terror to an end. The guillotine spread beyond France to Germany, Italy, and Sweden. Thousands of people were executed in Nazi-occupied Poland during World War II. Hamida Jandoubi was executed in France in 1977, marking the final act of the guillotine. Whirligig. Imagine being confined to a 6-foot-high cylindrical cage that is suspended and rapidly rotated in mid-air. The whirligig, a horrible contraption, was designed to cause prolonged anguish and humiliation, rather than speedy death. Unlike many other torture devices, the whirligig was designed to cause severe nausea and dizziness, as well as the psychological trauma of being trapped in a small, spinning cage. It was a harsh punishment used by the British Army, especially in military situations, to instill terror and discipline. The whirligig's design was simple, but efficient in its torturing nature. A cylindrical cage, typically formed of metal, was suspended from 2 pivots at the top and bottom. The victim would be confined inside, usually facing harsh punishment for some type of disobedience or wrongdoing. The cage was then forcibly rotated, forcing the subject to experience a never-ending spinning motion. This caused dizziness and nausea, resulting in severe physical suffering. One of the most significant historical usages of whirligig happened in Tangiers, a British-controlled area in the 17th century. Here, the contraption was more terrifying than the pillory, stocks, or wooden horse. It earned a reputation for this. Why? It wasn't just about the pain. It was about causing a mind-numbing, body-contorting sensation. Women, in particular, feared the whirligig. Its speed made them vomit and faint, weakening them both mentally and physically. Accounts of those punished by the whirligig are obscure. Historical records of such punishments are often incomplete or exaggerated. However, one terrifying tale says that in Tangiers, disobedient women, or those who violated military standards, were punished with the whirligig, frequently for minor transgressions that would otherwise be dealt with less harshly. The spin was meant to humiliate and break the victim's spirits, exhausting them physically and humbling them. Whirligigs became obsolete as views around punishment changed. Such technologies became obsolete as the military and society sought kinder methods. Shocking chair. A horrific milestone occurred in the halls of Auburn Prison in New York on the 6th of August, 1890. William Kemmler, convicted of murder, was the first person to face the electric chair. Kemmler, strapped to a wooden seat studded with menacing electrodes, said his final words, "Take it easy and do it properly. I'm in no hurry." What followed was neither swift nor merciful, marking a terrible beginning for this new mode of capital execution. Alfred P. Southwick, a dentist, created the electric chair after witnessing an accidental electrocution in 1881. Southwick, believing that electricity could provide a painless death, set off a cascade of events that would forever change execution practices. Corporate conflicts spurred its growth, with Thomas Edison urging its use to undermine George Westinghouse's alternating current. Ironically, Westinghouse generators powered the initial execution. Kemmler's execution revealed the weaknesses in this horrific innovation. The initial jolt failed, leaving him alive and resulting in another, longer rush of electricity. Witnesses were appalled, and the media described it as worse than hanging. George Westinghouse said, "They would have done better with an axe." Despite its violent introduction, the electric chair became popular. By the early 20th century, it had become America's dominant execution method. Ohio created a portable version known as Old Sparky, which performed 315 executions. Notable cases, such as Ruth Snyder's in 1928, increased its reputation. A hidden photograph of Snyder in the chair stunned the nation, sparking questions about the ethics of capital punishment. The chair's reputation for merciful execution suffered from botched efforts. This included a 1946 case with Willie Francis, who survived his first electrocution due to a technical fault. His case moved to the Supreme Court, presenting serious ethical concerns. By the 1970s, fatal injection had replaced the chair, which was regarded as more merciful. Nonetheless, the electric chair endured, creating headlines into the 21st century. Notably, in 2018, Tennessee executed Edmund Zagorski, whose dying words chillingly mirror the state's grim legacy, "Let's rock." The electric chair is still a disturbing image of America's battle between justice and evil. Drunkard's cloak. Also known as the Newcastle cloak, it was an unusual and humiliating punishment used in England, particularly during the 17th century. Unlike the usual prison sentences or punishments of the time, the drunkard's cloak aimed to publicly shame drunks. The device itself was surprisingly simple, but effective in its goal of humiliation. The cloak wasn't a traditional garment, but rather a large barrel. The barrel was hollowed out, with a hole cut at the top for the person's head to stick through. Smaller holes were cut on the sides of the person's arms. Once they were inside, the barrel was closed, trapping them in the wooden contraption. The individual would then be paraded through the streets. The whole town would see it. It was a public punishment for drunkenness. This punishment became more common after the 1551 Alehouses Act. It made drunkenness a civil offence in England. The act was meant to curb the excessive consumption of alcohol, particularly in alehouses. The Newcastle cloak, or the drunkard's cloak, became popular in the 1650s for punishing repeat offenders, especially during England's Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell aimed to shut down alehouses, particularly in royalist areas. It made people use the cloak more. It shamed and controlled them. Ralph Gardner's 1655 book, England's Grievance Discovered, is one of the first to describe the drunkard's cloak. He recounts John Willis's tale about men in Newcastle. They were paraded in a barrel-like cloak. They would walk through the streets, hidden in a barrel. Only their heads and arms were exposed. This bizarre spectacle was a form of public shaming for those guilty of drunkenness or other similar offenses. The drunkard's cloak was not unique to England. It was also used in other parts of Europe, including Holland and Denmark. There, it was known as the Spanish mantle. Samuel Pepys, a famous English diarist, mentioned it in his diary. He saw it being used in The Hague in 1660. In 1862, a newspaper described its use in America. A man forced to wear a similar oak frame looked like a half-hatched chicken as he shuffled through the streets. The drunkard's cloak was an unusual brief chapter on public punishment. Its use shows how society sought to control and shame the unruly. Pair of Anguish. The Pair of Anguish is a gruesome torture device that was used during the medieval period, notorious for its extreme cruelty and the intense pain it inflicted on its victims. The device was shaped like a pear. It was inserted into the victim's body, both from the mouth and the bottom, depending on the punishment. Once inserted, the device was slowly expanded by turning a screw, causing horrific internal damage and unbearable pain. This torture method aimed to physically torment, humiliate, and terrorize its victims. The Pair of Anguish was typically made of iron and had a design resembling a metal pear with 4 expandable segments. The screw mechanism allowed for gradual expansion. The victim would feel increasing pain as the device expanded. The primary purpose of the device was to cause extreme internal injury. In some cases, it would tear through the victim's body, causing severe bleeding and internal damage and often leading to death. The device was used as a torture tool and to extract confessions. It was often used on accused criminals or heretics during the Inquisition. The Pair of Anguish was designed to humiliate its victims. Inserting it into private body parts added to their degradation. The device expanded slowly, causing intense pain. This was a form of psychological torture, lasting as long as the torturers wanted. It was used across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially during the Inquisition. There, accused witches, heretics, and criminals faced such horrors to force confessions. Thank you for watching the video. Stay tuned for more interesting stories.